far too quickly. This wonderful, wonderful 5 days with the Ascended Masters is drawing to a conclusion, and we feel as if we have only touched upon the surface of the whole magnificent God consciousness of the lovers of life in the persons of the Ascended Masters and in the person of your own being, your own individualized God-free being, your blessed presence. There have been, in a sense, two overriding goals for this class. To some degree, at least, we hope that we have achieved the first of those, which is to sketch out for those who are already the disciples of the Ascended Masters a greater, deeper appreciation for the magnificence of life as it is to be discovered exclusively within the level of God-conscious perfection and harmony and purity. The realization that everything that is enjoyable and happy to be experienced by child or adult, all of this can be had without any real true sacrifice, except the forsaking of one's miseries, one's chains of limitations, the binding desires and the recalcitrant habit patterns that have grown up over so many earthly incarnations. I think all of you are at least beginning to appreciate the idea that there within your mighty I Am presence, within the way of life which has been laid out for you by the Ascended Masters in so many different ways, is every joy, every fulfillment, every satisfaction that you will want for no good thing, and that you are putting your feet upon the bottom rungs of a golden ladder that, like Jacob's ladder, reaches from heaven to earth, and each rung is a precept, a golden precept of the Ascended Master way of life. I think you are coming to realize the greater wisdom in sloughing off anything that is not part of the true identity of your own beloved mighty I Am presence. In addition to this goal, we are actually tackling a very ambitious challenge, which is going to be, I'm sure, the work of many, many years, and perhaps even some who will follow on after us. And that is to speak to the world, to the millions who are in ignorance of the beauty of Ascended Masters, of the cosmic law, of the absolute joy and happiness and magnificence to be discovered in appreciating one's true origin and source in the mighty I Am presence, and coming to realize, as we are beginning to do, that there is so very much to argue on behalf of this path for everyone. And indeed, if we are to have the teachings become a world religion, the world religion of the 21st century, we will have to learn how to communicate the real kernel and pith of our message to many, many millions of life streams. I have to confess to you, in some respects, that there are some experiences that I have had channel surfing, the religious channels, and I'm not talking about channeling, but the religious channels on the cable television where there are so many well-intended ministers, mostly Protestant as well as others, who are seeking to propagate the Christian message. And I have to confess that from time to time, the chills do run up and down my spine to even contemplate that in any way that someone looking in on our services would ever form the same, forgive the vernacular, kooky opinion about some of the things that do go on these religious channels. I'm saying this because, as you may recall in the parable of Jesus, there were many who were called to the wedding feast, and many who were equipped to take that next step and move up higher. And so it is that there are many in the world with the refinement of character, a certain natural wholesomeness about themselves, a certain freedom of opportunity to spend their time as they would wish, a certain scientific or educated background that could allow them to move rather quickly into these teachings, and in some ways, a very important characteristic, and that is that they are not, at the present time, hidebound in a particular religious dogma. This is a very important quality. I still remember the terse comment of beloved El Morya, the observation that he made long ago in the Theosophical era. You may or may not know that there were a lot of local chapters of the Theosophical Society that were started in India, in the various cities. And amongst those chapters were some that were made up of the highest caste, the Brahmin caste, the pure Brahmins of the Hindu faith. And the interesting thing was that amongst the lowly Westerners who were a part of some of those societies, as well as amongst others of less economic well-being or not a part of that Brahmin priestly caste, there were letters being sent to them by El Morya and Khatumi. There were visitations that occurred many times during this era. Whereas in the case of the chapters that were made up exclusively of the pure Brahmins, they did not have the slightest little breath of the appearance of any of the masters. Now, at their own insistence, according to their dietary laws and their laws of association, they are not to associate with anyone beneath their class, beneath their caste. They're not to be contaminated by improper sharing of food or utensils, and even regular association in a meeting, for example. All of this is strictly forbidden. And since they were letter perfect to the purity of their upbringing, they insisted that this exception be made for them. And so when they brought their complaints and cited the example of two rather worldly Englishmen, one an ornithologist and another who was an editor of a newspaper, they complained about why these two gentlemen should be receiving such an abundance of Mahatma letters, while on their part they were entirely neglected. And El Morya explained that the religious dogma that was so firmly entrenched and thrusting forth from the egos of those who were the pure Brahmins was a repellent force which by itself made it absolutely impossible for the masters to associate with them. And Morya went on to say, whereas in contrast, we find no opposition in these two gentlemen because they don't have any religion. And in that case, not having any religion was better than absolutely having a hidebound prejudice in favor of an old religion, an old wineskin, if you will, that could not hold the new wine. So it is a fertile ground for the teachings of the Ascended Masters. to speak to those who are not entrenched in a superstitious straitjacket in their minds about what constitutes the truth. And yet, when we see so much that goes on the television in the religious areas, you really don't want to have any association with a great deal of those things that do go on. So, as much as we have been talking mostly during this conference about what the Ascended Masters are and what this path is, I would like to say to this group, and I look forward someday to looking directly into the lens of the television camera and speaking heart to heart to that great unwashed masses of society in the West as well as around the world, and telling them what the Ascended Masters are not. And so if you will give me a few moments, I will just list off a few things that the Ascended Masters and their disciples are not. First of all, they are not fanatics. They are not religious fanatics who have adopted some particular ideology and have decided that everyone else in the world is going to hell in a handbasket except for themselves, and that they can be righteously indignant and all is fair for them because they are so chosen and so possessed of the exclusive truth that everyone else is to be discounted. That kind of mindless fanaticism has no place amongst the Ascended Masters. Nor are the Ascended Masters, and forgive me for the cliche, the Ascended Masters are not New Age mellow. The Ascended Masters aren't floating off on pink clouds, just figuring that if they pick the right color crystal and put it in the right chakra on their bodies, that all of a sudden it's going to make everything all right. Unlike Shirley MacLaine, they don't look to previous embodiments that they shared with their pet cat or dog. They don't talk to the animals in that sense, psychoanalyze them, or have regression for the animals. They are not eccentric. They're not like the absent-minded professor who is so drifted off into an abstract world of his own imagining that they are not very grounded and practical and realistic. They are not going to be speaking in tongues, glossolalia. They're not going to be holy rollers. They're not going to be in the Appalachians picking up rattlesnakes because it says in the Bible that you can do that. They are not out of touch with reality. The Ascended Masters are sane. They are practical. They have good mental health, if you will. And so do we. They are not part of a fringe, radical ideology that is going to be around for a little while as a fad and then fade away, never to be again. The Ascended Masters are not to be discovered on the science fiction channel. They are not otherworldly in that sense as it is portrayed on the science fiction channel. The transcendence of this path we will get into in a few moments about the wholesomeness and the naturalness of this path. And so you should have the understanding that a great deal that goes under the cloak of religion today is churned out of the astral and the psychic planes. And it has a psychic warp and distortion somewhere in its expression. It is very unfortunate for our Protestant brothers and sisters, and I think I can somewhat speak on this subject, having been born into the Methodist Church, evangelical church, and been raised in that era, that in their search for the miraculous, in their search for the Holy Spirit, for something more, they kind of are like a little child, a little boy with his first chemistry set, only in place of having very harmless chemicals and colored dyes in the chemistry set, it's laced with nitroglycerin and dynamite and blasting caps and matches. And so they are dabbling in areas, groping their way along, trying to transcend what they have inherited. But it is very much fraught with great dangers, because many things which can masquerade as truth emerge out of that astral plane and out of that psychic plane. And it is one of the greatest travesties that so much psychism has flooded the world since the first messengers of the Ascended Masters came forth, since HPB, since Beloved Godfrey, and the early messengers of the 1930s. I recall an article that was written rather ruefully by Helena Blavatsky a few years after she started her work with the Masters and after Sinnett published The Occult World and Esoteric Buddhism. She pointed out that before the Mahatma letters with Kuthumi began, and the correspondence between himself and Sinnett, that in the spiritualistic newspapers and periodicals of North America, while there were plenty of Uncle Johns and Aunt Minnies who were working through the seances and the mediums of that time, there wasn't a single instance of a Kuthumi. But as soon as those books were published, Kuthumi started popping up everywhere, which is the nature of the psychic, to imitate the real. And so it is in the 21st century that it takes a very developed heart flame to be able to connect with the vibration of the genuine Ascended Masters when they encounter it through the printed word, through the internet, through any other means of communication. Because the name Kuthumi, the name Saint Germain, and so forth, are merchandised far and wide. There are many, many coppers, fool's gold coins that are minted and are an inflationary wave that is out there across the face of the earth. And one of the greatest disservices that these things do is to vaccinate individuals who might otherwise find the light of the Master's teachings, because they encounter one after another, after another, after another of these unfortunate portrayals, these masquerades of the Masters. And having formed an opinion of the falsity of those masquerades, they are ready to stereotype and assign that to anything that comes along, which is so very tragic. And that is one of the thrusts that we are trying to make in this conclave, is that you can be supremely proud of your Ascended Master sponsors and friends whom you know. They are men and women who can move in any circle of the world and hold their own. They can talk politics, law, science, music, art, philosophy, charity, healing. You name the field, and there are many amongst the Ascended Masters who can hold their own and more, lead the way in those fields. Having kind of run the gamut there, we will have to, as a community, find ways to gently introduce students to our teachings as the time goes by. I wonder whether, for example, a full-throated decree session, such as we just gave, should be the very first introduction that someone finds to the Ascended Masters when they're channel surfing someday. That might be a little daunting for the individual. There's a number of reasons for that, but outwardly, in some respects, I guess I would have to concede that it does take on some of the appearances of the way things are in other places, not understanding the law that is being enacted. Then you have to contend with the fact that sometimes a cosmic being is standing there on the platform. And when the fire of that cosmic being is seeking to affect the world order and release light across the face of the earth, you better believe that there is an immensity of light that is trying to all come through the one little chalice of the messenger's consciousness. And when all of that immensity is coming through, I don't know how to compare it to, except maybe if you imagine that you had a team of 4 horses on one side of you and another team of 4 horses on the other side of you, and you are holding the reins of all of these 8 horses, and they're all trying to go out in their own way at the same time, and you are expected to hold the balance of that. Your face might take on a little bit of a strained appearance at that moment. That wouldn't make you a crazy person or someone who was radical or eccentric. It would just be a reflection. So many times when the Ascended Masters address you, they have many, many purposes. And many times that includes world service. It includes speaking to the heart flames of souls and life streams that are asleep around the world, and inwardly at least shouting to those heart flames for them to awaken and releasing a tremendous amount of light along those lines. So you, as the first witnesses for new students, have a challenge to share with them your experience and gently communicate to them more and more about your experience and the authenticity and the legitimacy of that experience, and to gently acclimate those students so that as they come more directly into the intensity of our quarterly conferences and even our Sunday services, that they will not be swept away by the whirlwind action of the Holy Spirit as it comes across. By no means do we say that life in higher worlds is not going to be exalted or transcendent. It will be all of these things. It will have a magnificence about it that is hard to approximate anywhere on this world outside of nature herself. Nature herself in the macrocosm of mountain ranges and waterfalls and snowstorms and all of the beauties of the large parts of nature, they really are the signature of the great God consciousness that we are inheriting. They are the character traits of our own individual Mighty I Am presence, which has such a vast consciousness. But with all of that, we would have you understand the wholesomeness and the naturalness of the Ascended Master Octaves. A number of times, one of the things that the Masters have pointed out is that when you first step into those worlds, there might be just a momentary period of adjustment when it seems a little bit different. But that passes almost immediately, and in its place, there comes a restoration of memory to where those inner realms are not something new. They are not some strange, undiscovered new continent or frontier, but they are home. It is a homecoming, a return that is taking place. And this is because the memory of all of your time in those inner worlds is always contained within the causal body. And when the consciousness of your causal body is restored to you, of course, it is a homecoming. And the naturalness of that comes across, not the feeling like, oh my goodness, I just stepped into the twilight zone. How am I going to adjust to all of this? So that is a very, very important understanding for everyone to have. One of the ways that beloved Jesus sought to teach this understanding, and it certainly does apply to Ascended Master students, is to reference the consciousness of the child. So, if I might be permitted, I'd like to share his words with you on that consciousness. The disciples came to Jesus saying, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And Jesus called a little child to come to him and set the child in the midst of them and said, "Truly I say to you, except you be converted and become as little children, you shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. Whosoever therefore will humble himself as this little child, the same is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whosoever will receive such a little child in my name receives me." There are a number of things about this consciousness of the child that beloved Saint Germain has referenced. One of them, which is very, very clear, is that in that little infant there is not a self-consciousness for the most part. A little child doesn't say to himself, "What are those people thinking about me?" When the child is at play, it is spontaneously at play. There is no attention that is turned back upon the individual with a self-conscious pretense about it. Therefore, the child is free to be spontaneous. And this is the nature of every ascended being, and as well the nature of your own I Am presence. I know I have made this statement before, but allow me to repeat it, that it is quite astonishing, and it is a humbling experience when a great cosmic being such as Sanakumara enters your presence, comes into the room where you happen to be, and all you can perceive is how you're standing in front of Mount Everest or at the foot of a monolith like El Capitan, and you're looking up at this being whose attainment you can't even see how far the attainment goes. And you want to think to yourself, doesn't this being know how magnificent he or she is? Because when that being comes in, there is a self-effacement. There is a naturalness. There is no putting on of airs. There's no pontificating. As Lord Lanto said years ago, we, the Ascended Masters, do not stoop to serve. We do not feel that we stoop to serve. There is just no real sense of one's own self-importance, if you will. And so it's impossible for a master to ever receive offense. It's impossible for one of the masters to ever say, well, the students are giving too much attention to so-and-so and not enough attention to me. That is just not in their psyche. It is not part of their nature. So they are very spontaneous, and this gives them a freedom to create and to enjoy life and to go on in all of the magnificence that there is at inner levels. It also means that they don't become top-heavy. There is no pride to go before a fall because there is no sense of self in that regard. What there is for them when they look at who they are is they look at the greater allness of being, the allness that the Godhead is. And their concern is how to make life around them more comfortable, how to free life around them, which they identify with. They are always, as Jesus said, he who would be the greatest, let him be the servant of all. And so it is that the Ascended Masters are the servant. In their own mind, they are serving the mighty I Am presence that they observe upon the threefold flame of our hearts. They are serving that presence in the service that they render to us. And it is the greatest joy of their life to render that service. Here is one of the ways in which beloved Saint Germain described this very process. The most important key which we can release to the alchemist at this stage of his development is to be found in the words of Jesus, "Whosoever shall not receive the kingdom of God as a little child shall in no wise enter in." All of the pristine beauties of nature, the ethereal highlights whose gentle glow can be sensed by the budding spiritual faculties of the children of God, hold in their essential content the sweet and creative longing of a child. He goes on to say, while I do not wish to disabuse the mind of the students who have such high and mighty opinions of the Ascended Masters, of any proper exaltation which they have clothed our office, I do feel the need to point out, not only from my own experience, but from the experience of those who are greater than I in the hierarchy, that the higher we have gone in our contact with the deity, the more childlike, the more simple, and the more beautiful have been God's representations. And therefore we conclude that the innocence of nature is the greatest key to her potential. And we amplify the need of the children of men, the children of God, to empty their minds of the dregs of all of the turbulent emotions that they have engaged their energies. At the same time, he goes on to say that being an innocent little child is not the same as being a fool before the world, of subjecting oneself as a cat's paw to the oppression by any other part of life. The child mind is the greatest of all minds because its own native innocence is its best defense. It is not surrounded by a host of outer thoughts and crowding concepts, and therefore it is free to develop symmetry and color and sound and light, and to develop new ideas. Free to create. And its supreme goal is simply to spread happiness in all of its forms throughout all of life. he goes on to say on this subject, I have walked and talked with the elder gods of the race. I have met with the greatest interplanetary masters, with cosmic and angelic beings. I've attended the ceremonies in the grand halls of the retreats, strolled the cosmic highways, and in short had the most wondrous experiences since my own ascension. And with me yet are all of the fond memory of my worldly experiences prior to my ascension. But none of these, even the very highest of them, can be compared to the experiences which I have had within myself in the mind of the divine man-child. Truly eye hath not seen, nor heard, nor entered into the heart of man the things which God hath prepared for them that love him. What a pity that more do not shed the sense of far off and only future good. For the secrets of life are to be found here below as well as above. So I hope that that gives you some idea of the naturalness of the Ascended Masters and of the spontaneous joys that are a part of their life. One of the other ways in which this challenge meets us is that as religions develop and there is the sense of strife within various elements, it seems so very easy to foment conflict. This is on the general subject of conflict. I'd like to just point out one observation about this that is very telling. And this is something that all of you can use when people try to polarize different arguments. Conflict is a result of discord in the feeling world of individuals. And it is looking for an excuse to explode. It is an explosion of anger that is waiting to happen. It is looking for a trigger point. And it has everything to do with what is already in the emotional world and the mind of the individual. It is predisposed to venting that conflict through anger. So, on the largest scale, sometimes conflict is portrayed, for example, as conflict between nations. And there are reasons why such conflicts exist. If there's peace between nations, then you can find conflict inside of the same nation. If there would be peace inside the same nation, then you can find conflict between, let's say, men and women, to where one becomes the enemy of the other. You can find conflict between families, conflict like the Hatfields and the McCoys, had their feuds back in the 1930s. You can have conflict between tribes, conflicts between peoples. The fallacy here is that if the day's conflict were to be resolved, there would be no more conflict. That is a total and utter fallacy. Because if one side were to win out, then within that group that had won, there would be new polarizings that would occur that would create new conflicts within that particular group. And so there are a lot of different fractionalizations and compartmentalization that is taking place. Young against old, generation gaps, things are talked about that. You can have conflicts between all kinds of groups, and there are such conflicts. And inevitably, those who are part of those conflicts adopt an attitude of righteous indignation that their cause is not being addressed and remedied. Right now, across the face of the earth, there is a lot of conflict, as you well know, polarizing the civilized world, which seems, mind you, to have at its core a conflict of religious ideology, a conflict of types of government ideology. But the truth of the matter is that, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that in certain parts of the world, those segments that are fighting for their cause were to win out, and they were to have everything the way they wanted. No sooner would that happen than everybody who'd been working together up to that time would all of a sudden once again separate out into conflicts and factions that would fight within one another. And in many of those societies, tribal leaders and factions between tribal leaders are a tradition that goes back many thousands of years. You can have conflict of that nature within any group. And if you were to reduce it down until the group size was one person, and that person had discord in their feeling worlds and in their mind, you would still have conflict. And the conflict would reverberate against the person's own body. And in one sense, there are certain diseases of the physical body where the body turns against itself and begins the destruction of its own organism, because it is the way in which that sense of conflict is vented. Do you follow that? It is going to work its way out one way or the other. So there never really is an approach to problem solving based upon the fact that one faction feels that it has been done wrong by another faction and therefore deserves to exact its pound of flesh. That's the object lesson of the Merchant of Venice, that righteous indignation and that pound of flesh is not real justice, and it certainly is not mercy. Over and against all of this, the teaching of the Ascended Masters was, in the Christian era, best put forward by beloved Hilarion as St. Paul. For in the early Christian church, there was a great deal of conflict as well. There was a great deal of factionalization and fractionalization. Before I leave that subject for just a moment, let me just make one last example of this. And I think it's really being borne out, unfortunately, in our society today, in our nation, the United States, where so many of us live. And that has to do with the acrimony between the various factions of political persuasion in our nation, where there is a greater polarizing, a greater righteous indignation, and that kind of engendering which is going on, to where there is more a sense that the enemy is not outside of our borders, but the enemy, the blood enemy, the sworn enemy, is the person of the opposite political ideology or the opposite political party. Beloved Godfrey, as George Washington, I haven't looked this up in a very long time, but I think I learned it in my 8th grade civics class, that in one of his parting farewell addresses, he tried to direct the direction of the United States away from the polarizing of political parties. Of course, that didn't succeed any longer than the time it took him to give his address, because those political parties were already separating and polarizing and going at one another. But it's quite an amazing thing that in our country today, in some respects, there's more of a no-holds-barred, all's fair in war and politics view of the enemy being in the opposite camp, rather than the idea that we are all Americans and we have more in common than we have animosity towards one another. Well, this was going on at the time of the earliest Christian church. There were those who had the idea that only Jews could be Christians, that you had to follow the old Mosaic law as well as the newest tradition. There were those who felt that the Gentiles could be brought into the Christian faith. Were they to follow the dietary laws? Were they not to follow those? Were they to have these strict codes? Who was going to outrank who? Would apostles outrank bishops, for example? Was speaking in tongues allowed? Was it not allowed? Were faith healings allowed? Were you allowed to eat meat if it had been sacrificed to an idol? And there were all kinds of factions. All this stuff was going on. And in the midst of all of that, while all of this focusing on all this outer stuff was going on, the heart and the real message was being ground underfoot. It was being lost altogether in the midst of all of that bureaucratic accretion that was, even in the first generation, already building itself up. Those wranglings had found their way into the early church that was being established at Corinth, and there was all this jockeying for position, for political power, and for who was going to be in charge of who else, and all of that was being wrestled with amongst all of those factions. And they finally decided that they would pick Paul as the one who would hold an arbitration of how all of this would work out. And so they designated that Paul should set the pecking order of these various ones who had different gifts in different areas. And here is what he had to say about it in 1 Corinthians. Those members of the body, he's comparing the members of the church to one body. Those members of the body which we think to be less honorable, upon those we bestow more abundant honor. For our comely parts have no need, but God hath tempered the body, giving more abundant honor to the part which lacks. You are all part of the body of Christ, and its members in particular. God hath set some to the church, apostles, prophets, teachers, workers of miracles, healers, helps, governments, those who speak in a diversity of tongues. Are all apostles? Are all prophets? Are all teachers? Are all workers of miracles? Do all have the gift of healing? Do all speak in tongues? Do all interpret? Yet, and here it comes to the most important thing, I shall show you a more excellent way than all of this whole rigmarole put together. Though I speak with the tongues of men and angels and have not charity, I am a sounding brass and an empty tinkling cymbal. Though I have the gift of prophecy, understand all mysteries, all knowledge, though I have all faith, so that I might remove mountains, but have not charity, I am nothing. Though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and give my body to be burned, and have not charity, it profiteth me nothing. So all of this wrangling amongst what should be harmonious members of the same body, not only is it a disservice, but it doesn't really accrue karmically to your causal body when it is done out of those self-centered motives The motives must be selfless love, such as a little child might possess. So the opposite of all of this strife that is so entrenched in human nature on this planet, the opposite of all of this is charity. Charity suffers long. Charity is kind. Charity does not envy. It does not vaunt itself, is not puffed up with ego, doth not behave itself unseemly, does not seek its own. Charity is not easily provoked. Charity does not think evil. Charity does not rejoice in another's iniquity. Charity rejoices in truth. It bears all things. It believes all things. It hopes all things. It endures all things. And charity never fails. Whether there be prophecies or not, they will fail. Whether they be those who speak in tongues, sooner or later the tongues will stop wagging. Whether there be knowledge, knowledge will pass away. For all of us only know part of the story, and we only prophesy part of the story. But when that which is perfect is come, that which is in part shall be done away. When I was a child, I spoke as a child and understood as a child and thought as a child. When I became a man, I put away these childish things. For now we see through a glass darkly, but then we shall see face to face. Now abideth faith, hope, and charity, these three. But the greatest of all of these is charity. So this is the unguent, the universal solvent that must be the motive force for all of us in our service to one another. When you don't have charity in your aura, when charity has not swallowed up whatever residual anger or conflict there is in your own world, it's like having the gears in a transmission or the pistons in a car without any oil to lubricate the gears. And there's going to be friction, and there's going to be a seizing up of the engine. So that charity is at the core of all of the ascended masters and the core of your own mighty I am presence. It's not called the white fire core without reason. The core is that givingness of love, which is not puffed up, does not vaunt itself over someone else. It does not immediately lay its jaws into a vice-like grip of thinking evil or negatively of someone else or of others, but has this upwelling of charity that pours forth for all the world to see. Had we another week for lovers of life, we could take the 7 Chohans of the rays and the God attributes of each of those rays and show you 7 illustrious masters who are sane, who are not only adept at their particular God qualities, but they are also practical, generous, kind, balanced, natural, at the same time exalted beings that you would be proud to call your friends. We don't have that time. The only thing I would remind you of, as far as something that all of them share in common, is that they all have the virtues of the Christ. There is, in some respect, a generic difference between the 7 rays and the 5 secret rays and the virtues of the Christ. The world has a proficiency in a lot of the things that are going on in the 7 rays, whether they've ever called it that or not. They have all of the qualities of organization and of science and healing and diplomacy and ritual, all those kinds of things. But for Ascended Master students, what is needed are the qualities of your Holy Christ self. And these all are born out of this God love that Hilarion was referring to. They are more than human qualities. They are divine qualities. They are found in the realms of Ascended Master perfection in your Christ self and in your Mighty I Am presence. They may appear to be somewhat irrational by human standards. Many of the stories in the Sermon on the Mount by Beloved Jesus told in the book of Matthew talk about these irrational things that people wouldn't ordinarily do, which are part of the nature of the Christ. Things like love thy enemy, pray for those who persecute you. If he smite you on the one cheek, turn to him the other. If he take your robe, give him your cloak as well. If he asks to walk 1 mile, walk with him 2 miles. Be ye perfect. Let your kindness and your behavior be impersonal, blessing the just and the unjust alike, the way that the rain falls on the just and the unjust, the way the sun shines on the just and the unjust. These things that appear to be so irrational and antithetical to what it means to be sane and normal, they only make sense in the view of you being not just a human being, but being your Holy Christ self and being your Mighty I Am presence. And then these virtues of the Christ have to shine forth in spite of everything else that goes on outwardly. That's where the virtues of the Christ come, and that's where you get an opportunity to transcend yourself when you meet the challenges of the Christ, which are born all out of this love. The first of those being responsibility. You have enough innate love for others that even though you're not expected to, you take responsibility to make things better. You have a sense that, okay, maybe I wasn't assigned to this, but it's a job that needs to be done. Look at all the people who are going to be benefited from it. I'm willing to take on that responsibility. I am my brother's keeper. I am the Good Samaritan who doesn't pass on by the other side, but stops to help. That is a quality of the Holy Christ self. Another part of the virtues is the ability to receive power without abusing it. It's divine authority. When you are vested with an authority, it doesn't go to your head. You don't vaunt that authority over others, but you have a judicious, balanced use of power towards the goal. That's what authority is. When you receive that authority and the assignment, because you've accepted the burden of responsibility, you appreciate the fact that there's a job that has to be done and it must be done. And there really aren't any two ways about it. So if you don't feel that you're up to the task, it doesn't change the fact that it must be done, and so you find a way to do it anyhow. You transcend your own limited capacities of the past and actually become more today than you were yesterday. There's more expansion. All of that comes out of that God quality of authority, and doing it all the while without being prideful or abusing that quality of authority. The next quality, of course, is the very white fire core of the white fire core, which is the essence of sacrifice. Greater love hath no man that he give up his life for his brother. Giving up your life in that sense doesn't mean necessarily being willing to die on a battlefield or some other drastic way, but day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, even sometimes lifetime after lifetime, living not for yourself, but living on behalf of others. That's giving up your life. That is putting the welfare of others ahead of your own. That is the spirit of sacrifice, of literally giving yourself away. Only someone who has that spontaneous self-effacement of the little child is going to be able to do that. The next of these is one of the toughest of all of these secret ray qualities of the Christ to deal with, and that has to do with the necessity ray. Because quite often, outwardly, it is correct that outwardly, the outer self many times simply will not necessarily have the tools to do what's asked of it. I love the way that Serapis Bede portrayed this many years ago. He talked about feeling like you were a little tiny scarab beetle back in ancient Egypt, and you were minding your own business, walking across the sand, and all of a sudden you came to this wall. And from your vantage point, the wall went up indefinitely into the sky and in both directions off as far as the eye could see. And you, as this tiny little scarab, are assigned to topple over this entire wall. And Serapis's explanation is that that is life viewed from the standpoint of the four lower bodies. What one must do in that case is identify with the mighty I Am Presence who looms well above any finite wall of opposition and topple it over by identification with the presence. So the necessity ray asks the question, how will you handle pressure? Pressure. Everyone is being fashioned from a lump of coal into a diamond. And along the way, there will be times when you will feel like a lump of coal that's a mile down under the surface of the earth. And there's heat and pressure, and it just seems to be relentless. But in the midst of all of that, that is the necessity ray. That's when you don't cut and run. You don't say, like Pontius Pilate, I wash my hands of my responsibility. Someone else will have to worry about this. I'm going home. I'm going to quit and leave the scene. The necessity ray really challenges individuals to draw upon all that their I Am Presence is and to bring it forth into their world and to gain mastery. It's where the initiations are won or lost, as the case may be. One of the tricks to learn now that we know about our mighty I Am Presence is to always remember that you can use Aikido on the necessity ray. You know, in Aikido, they train you, I guess, to use your opponent's force, to flip that force around and use it against them. Or so I've been told. Well, that is true as well of necessity's ray. Necessity's ray, for all of its pressure, is also the demand for that to be resolved. And since you are only in the necessity because you accepted responsibility, assumed the authority, and made the sacrifice, you are in your authority to demand of the cosmos that the cosmos meet that necessity. Find a way to resolve that necessity here and now. And when you act in that office of your authority, because you know that the service you're to render has to be rendered, you pull a miracle out of the necessity. So it is a sword, as Moria says, whose two-edged sword cuts both ways. And last but by no means least, there is the constancy and the practicality of the Christ as a virtue. What is constancy? Reliability. When Lanello was here the other night, Thursday night, as he was standing there before the dictation, I had this sense that I often have about Lanello, that he may be, as he is, a very fun-loving ascended master in his Buddhic consciousness. But when push comes to shove, he always seems to be there at the critical moment. You always seem to be able to count on him when the going gets tough. If you were choosing up teams for something, he's one of the first ones that you would choose on your team, because you would know that in the last inning, Lanello would still be there and still find a way to move into the breach and to win the victory, to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. That is the constancy ray that is like the rock of ages, that is always, always, always going to be there. You will find that every single ascended master has all of those virtues of the Christ in abundance. They were tried in the crucible of life, just as you and I are, and as all initiates on the path are tried. They have the fiery furnace of their own initiations that they have gone through, and they have passed these tests, passed them in the final analysis, because regardless of whatever else was going on, there was enough love at the core of their being. They weren't going to cut and run. They were going to stand, face, and conquer. Speaking of that love, I would just like to share with you in conclusion one of the portrayals of that captures the essence of all of these 5 secret rays, this intensity of love that blossomed in the heart of beloved Saint Germain when he was Francis Bacon, and in his most intimate autobiographical writings, which were the sonnets. He penned a very wonderful sonnet that had everything in it that has to do with these 5 secret rays and with this ultimate love and charity that St. Paul was speaking of. Let me not to the marriage of our hearts admit impediments. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no, it is an ever-fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. It is the star to every wandering bark, whose worth's unknown, although his height be taken. Love's not time's fool, although through rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come. Love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out even to the edge of doom. If this were error, and upon me proved, I never writ, nor I thee ever loved. Thank you.